We better stipulate we've known each other for a long time, but you're the governor, and
people have been calling me Haley a whole lot longer than they call me governor. So Peter, you can call me whatever you want to.
All right. Well, let's take this on right away. 1968. There's still talk about Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, and that the reason that white folks in the South, Mississippi, the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, that they became Republican was race. It was a reaction against the Civil Rights Acts and the advances that African Americans were making in the South.
Well, there's no question that in the 50s and probably in the 60s there was some of that. At the same time, the people that led the change of parties in the South, just as I mentioned earlier, was my generation.
Right.
My generation who went to integrated schools, or I went to integrated college, never thought twice about it. And it was the old Democrats who had fought for segregation so hard. By my time, people realized that was the past. It was indefensible. It wasn't going to be that way anymore. And so the people who really changed the South from Democrat to Republican was a different generation from those who fought integration. In fact, I can never forget when I mentioned we elected these two young congressmen, and we were just itching to get a senator. And one of my friends said, well, Haley, we're just a few funerals away. That you had some of the old crowd that just wasn't ever going to give up on the Democratic Party because it was the party of the Civil War, segregation. And some of those people gave up on it, and a lot of those people just aren't here anymore.
Haley, our governor, you ran for the Senate yourself in 1982. You lost by about 2.5 or 3 to 1 because your opponent was John Cornelius Stennis, who has an aircraft carrier named after him, was a legendary figure in the Senate and one of the great men of Mississippi. And one of the Democrats you're talking about, is that roughly when the generational change is taking place? There's young Haley Barbour stepping forward as a Republican, and there's John Stennis as a representative of the Old South. Is that a fair way to look at it?
It's kind of a pivot point. Actually, I got to beat 64 to 36, but I never expected your math to be very good. But that's not new. And Senator Stennis was a revered person. Yes, he was a segregationist, but he wasn't mean. He wasn't somebody who waved the bloody shirt. He did what his generation did. And when I ran against him in 1982, we were in the transition. We weren't anything like a Republican state. Ronald Reagan carried Mississippi in 1980 with 51% of the vote.
Oh, was it that close?
Yes, sir. And by 1984,
I had not remembered that.
Back to 84, it blew out the top.
Right.
But it was sort of the transition that ran from the late 60s when we were minuscule, that by the 80s we were starting to become competitive. And then as we went through the 80s and 90s, the Democrats started receding. And as I say, part of it was demographic because a lot of old people who had stayed faithful to the Democratic Party weren't there anymore. And a couple of other things, urbanization, industrialization, really homogenization. You know, Jackson, Mississippi became a whole lot more like Jackson, Michigan than it had ever been before. Interstates, McDonald's, the
South joined the rest of the United States.
That's exactly
in some way.
right. And I'll tell you at the same time, the United States became more like the South. It was a two-way, like most things in life, it was a two-way transition.